This is a video in a series of videos I'm making for a class I teach at ASU, PHI 328, History of Ancient Philosophy. Now we've been thinking about Plato, and we've been thinking about theories that he has the character Socrates present in the middle dialogues. And we've looked at three of those theories so far. We looked at the theory of recollection, the theory of forms, and the tripartite theory. And today we're going to look at the theory of justice. And so let's go to the first lecture on that topic. Now, the Republic, as I mentioned, I think maybe in a prior video, is long. It's 10 books long, so it's pretty involved. And that's why we have multiple lectures on it here. We've already seen one of the things that goes on in the Republic. That's the tripartite theory of the soul. We saw that in a prior lecture, and Socrates uses that theory in an argument he makes in the Republic about the just life. We'll see that momentarily. But now let's just think about uh, Book One of the Republic. It's in the style of a definitional dialogue. That's to say, it's a lot like what we've seen in, say, the Euthyphro, where Socrates has a conversation, turns to the matter of interest. In the Euthyphro, it's piety. Socrates asks what piety is. His interlocutor, Euthyphro, thinks he knows, but cannot give Socrates questions, answers to Socrates' questions without contradicting himself. And the dialogue ends with Euthyphro thinking that he's too busy to continue this, with Socrates wanting to continue, but Euthyphro thinking that he has better things to do in life. And this pattern we see also in Book One. The definition that Socrates initially is after is the definition for justice. And the dialogue ends without anyone managing to answer Socrates' questions without contradicting themselves. So that's the same. But we also have some twists in Book One that are a little different from what we've seen. The first is that we have three interlocutors with Socrates, three primary interlocutors, Cephalus, Polemarchus, and Thrasymachus. Plato's brothers, Glaucon and Admetus, are also in this dialogue, but they don't do much in Book One. Now we've seen this pattern, Socrates taking on more than one interlocutor in the Gorgias, and so we have this again here. And another twist we have, which we haven't really seen before, is that the question changes in the dialogue from what is justice to the question of whether the just life is better. And so what we really have in the Republic at a high level is Socrates telling us what he thinks justice is and giving us an argument to show that the just life is better. Now, when I say Socrates here, we're talking about the character in the dialogue. And remember that in the middle dialogues, the character no longer so clearly speaks for the historical figure. Okay, what we have is Plato trying to work out what he thought Socrates was trying to get at and to say it in a kind of detailed way. So as I said, we get the initial question, what is justice, with Cephalus. I think it's reasonably straightforward how this goes, and so that you can look at the notes and see what's going on there. He doesn't get far with Socrates, and he drops out of the conversation, and Polemarchus jumps in. He doesn't do a whole lot better, a little bit better, but I think again I don't need to repeat what I say in the lecture notes here. It's pretty clear. The more interesting figure is Thrasymachus and his conversation with Socrates in Book One. It's with Thrasymachus that we see the question change that I mentioned earlier, right? So at first, Thrasymachus tries to give Socrates an answer to the what is justice question, but eventually the subject of the conversation turns to whether the just life is better. And the common view, the view that Thrasymachus defends is that it's not always better. Sometimes it's in your interest to be unjust. This, I think, was a common view in ancient Athens where this conversation takes place, and I think it's also a common view today. Socrates, he has the uncommon view. He thinks it's never in anyone's interest to be unjust. You're always better off if you're just. And although Thrasymachus has the common view, he can't defend it, right? He's like Socrates' other interlocutors. He gets himself into contradiction. And one of the things that's interesting about Socrates' conversation with him is how Socrates brings this about. He argues that the soul has a function, and um, that things that have functions, right, ordinarily we think also have virtues. So, for example, if we say that a knife has the function of a knife is to cut, then we can pretty easily identify virtues in a knife. These would be the properties that make a knife a good knife, right? Needs to be sharp, balanced, etc. And so once we think the soul has a function, then it's going to be natural for Socrates to think that it has a virtue too. And what he gets Thrasymachus to agree to, that its virtue is justice. And then once he gets Thrasymachus to agree to that, he gives him an argument to try to show that injustice is never better, never more profitable for someone than justice. And Thrasymachus sees that he has beliefs that commit him to this, but he's not happy about it. And the dialogue ends with just in a way like we've seen in earlier dialogues, with Socrates lamenting that he really doesn't know what he wants to know. Let's see if we can find that passage. Let's see if it might be here. Yeah, a little bit past. So here we're going to the Perseus Digital Library where Plato's works are translated for us in a format that we can access for free. And Socrates starts saying here that in a kind of metaphorical way that things have not turned out well for him because he's acted like a glutton that snatches at every dish that comes along without properly enjoying the preceding one. And what he means is that they were initially asking what justice is, but they didn't get an answer to that. And then they turned to whether something about it, whether or not it's a virtue, and hence more profitable than injustice, and that they can't really answer that question because they haven't answered the what is justice question. And so, as Socrates says, for me, the outcome of the discussion is I know nothing. And this is where book one ends. And so let's go back just for a minute before we go into book two to this idea that the soul has a function and that its virtue is justice. Now, this we can remember, right, when we looked at Socrates in the earlier dialogues, that the Apology suggested to us that he believed that wisdom was the virtue of the soul, that all you really needed to have in order to live a good life was knowledge of what's good and bad. And here we have a slightly different idea that justice is the virtue of the soul. And so we get a new way of thinking about things here in the Republic. And it's the reason, at least in part, is the tripartite theory of the soul, right? By the time we get to the Republic, uh, Plato has come to question the picture of desire we have in the Protagoras, the picture that traditionally we associate with the historical Socrates and call Socratic intellectualism. In the tripartite theory, as we've seen, the soul has parts. It doesn't consist solely in reason. It has two non-rational parts as well. And these parts need to get along, so to speak. And when we think that that's what we need, wisdom, which will be a function of reason, of that part of the soul, it's not going to be the virtue. The virtue is that all the parts do their proper jobs. We'll see that in more detail. But anyway, that's part of the idea here, why we're moving away from the picture we had initially with Socrates, and we're thinking that that justice is the virtue of the soul. Now, if the Republic were just like an early dialogue devoted to the search for definitions, there'd be nothing more to it than the conversations that we've just quickly went through. But Plato's brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, they're not happy with the outcome in book one, right? They complain, complain maybe is too strong. They say that Socrates should not rest, that the subject matter that they're talking about is too important to let go. And although the other interlocutors in book one may be not ready to follow Socrates in a longer discussion, they are. And they tell Socrates to do more than simply refute others' views, but to prove himself that justice is better than injustice, to show that the just life is better. And they ask him to prove that it's better not because of external rewards, right? The idea is justice is not better because people give you things if you're just, to put the point very roughly. And injustice is not worse because people do things, punish you if you're unjust. The idea is that they want Socrates to prove that aside from those issues, that justice is better and injustice is always worse. That's what they want Socrates to show them, and they're willing to stick around and participate in a longer discussion. And that discussion begins in book two, right? So book one ends without successful answers to the two questions, what justice is and whether a just life is better. But Plato's brothers, Glaucon and Adeimantus, they're ready for a longer discussion, and Socrates gives them a longer discussion in the remaining books of the Republic, books 2 through 10. They issue this challenge to Socrates at the beginning of book 10. Beginning of book 2. Socrates agrees to take it on, and the remaining discussion, he tries to show that the just life is better. Now, the way these lectures are laid out, right, we have the first lecture really is basically on the opening conversation and the challenge. So the first lecture is on book 1 of the Republic and the very beginning of book 2. And the second lecture picks up with Socrates, the beginning of Socrates' answer to the challenge. So let's go there to that lecture. Well, we have, right, as I mentioned, Plato's brothers, silent in book 1, now unhappy with the outcome, pressing Socrates to give positive answers to the questions, not just simply to refute his interlocutors, as we've seen him do in the past. And Socrates agrees, and he goes on to give a long conversation, to engage in a long conversation where he describes what justice is in a city and what it is in an individual human being. Now, a city here is, it's the traditional translation for the word polis in Greek. I don't know if I have that word down here or not. Let's see. No, I should, but I don't. Let's see if it was in the prior lecture. Yeah, here we go. So this is the Greek word for that traditionally translates as city. You could see that, or at least you might be able to see that it would transliterate, right? If we were to map these Greek letters to English letters, it would be P-O-L-I-S. And it's roughly the origin of our words like political or politics. And here, the translation for city as city, like which I said, which is traditional, what we mean is not just simply a collection of people, which maybe is what we think of a city is now, but it's a set of rules that people obey when they live in that city. It's right. That's the way they do things in that city. And so he's going to tell us what justice would be in such an organization. And he's going to tell us what justice would be in an individual human being. Now, we see lots of twists, right? We already saw twists in book one. We're going to see some more twists here, right? And in the earlier dialogues, we don't get Socrates talking about instances of the virtue of character that he is thinking about, right? In the Euthyphro, for example, he pushes Euthyphro away from giving instances. Rather, he wants to know what piety is in general. But here in the Republic, we get two instances: justice in a city and justice in an individual human being. And if we ask ourselves why this is happening, the answer, unfortunately, Socrates doesn't say, right? So he doesn't have our questions. So he doesn't directly, at any rate, ever answer them. But if we look at the Gorgias, which in the traditional ordering of the dialogues comes before the Republic, the Gorgias is a late, early dialogue, probably. He says that that justice is what's fitting for human beings, right? And we can think that this is clear, taken as clear, agreed in the Republic. That's what justice is. It's what's appropriate with respect to human beings. That's not controversial, but it's not enough really to know that. We need to know what that is, what is appropriate or fitting with respect to human beings. And Thrasymachus himself, he pushes Socrates really to give a more detailed answer. He says, he complains here that Socrates should not just simply say that justice is that which ought to be, or the beneficial, or profitable, or gainful, or advantageous. He should say clearly and precisely what it is. And that seems to be what he's doing. So we can think of, so Thrasymachus makes this demand in book one, we can think in book two of what Socrates is doing is trying to give the more detailed answer that Thrasymachus is asking for, that we're taking it for granted that justice is what's appropriate with respect to human beings. And now we want to know what that is. And we want to know what that is with respect to human beings who are organized into a city. And we also want to know what that is with respect to an individual human being. Now, Socrates tells us that he's going to start, here's that word polis again, he's going to start with justice in the city, and then, right, once they know what that is, they're going to transfer, if they can, their results to justice in an individual human being. And Socrates, he thinks about justice in a city by thinking about the purpose of a city, right? And his idea is that, well, we organize ourselves into a city. We live according to the rough rules of organization in a city in order to get a better kind of life. And cities, they provide the benefits of group living. And of course, there's different ways human beings can organize themselves to provide these benefits. And we're going to think that a fitting organization is one that does this well. And what Socrates is going to do in books 2 through 4 is describe a city that he takes to do this well, and he's going to call such a city rightly founded. And so then, once we've described this city, which takes a while, we're going to look for what justice is in it. So we can think of the kind of thought that Plato is working with here as roughly this, right? So a city is an organization of human beings. In a just city, the organization is fitting. It's fitting because it achieves the purpose for which human beings live in cities. They live in cities to make their lives better. The better life they seek is the good life. So what Plato is doing in books 2 through 4 is working through some of these thoughts and setting out, having the character Socrates set out a city that does provide this life and hence is organized in a fitting way. And that fitting way is what we mean when we say the city is just. Okay. Now we want to, in following Socrates' discussion, we're going to want to keep our eye out for answers to certain questions. We want to find out what life the city provides, and we want to know what the parts are in the organization of the city, right? So parts, right, is the way Socrates is going to talk about how the various aspects of a city come together to produce a life for its citizens. And we want to know how these parts, once they're identified, provide the life they provide. Okay. Now, one of the parts in Socrates' rightly founded city consists in the guardians. The guardians are going to be the rulers, and they're going to be the people who know what's good and bad and develop rules for the citizens to follow in order to have the citizens live lives that are good, have them live these kinds of lives. And in order for a rightly founded city to have rulers, they have to produce them some way. And Socrates thinks that the method in the Republic, the method is an elaborate form of education. So he says that the guardians, they require the most knowledge and training of anyone in the city. If the city is going to provide the citizens a good life, we have to know what's good and bad. And this knowledge we have to give to the guardians. And so they undergo a long and detailed training or education. And so we talk about it here. I'm not going to really repeat it. You can take a look at that. I think it's pretty straightforward. But there are, again, a few little twists, right? So we saw Socrates not giving us any idea or never any suggestion that to know what's good and bad, we had to investigate a lot of special sciences. But in the Republic, we do. The guardians have a very long education process that requires stuff we might think is not really relevant to knowing what's good and bad. But Plato thinks it is here, right? We have to know arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, harmonics. There's a lot of higher education. But at some point, what we have in the education system is a parceling out of the people who do the kind of jobs that we need to have done in order for the citizens to live good lives. And one of these jobs is to rule. And Plato's idea here is you can't rule successfully if you don't know what's good and bad. So you have to equip the guardians with that knowledge, and this education system is what does it. And that, whoops, I didn't mean to click on that. And then Socrates thinks that the other two, he's going to think that there's three main parts in the city. The other two parts are going to be people who fulfill other functions in the city. And one of those functions is going to be the auxiliaries to the guardians. And what they're going to do is act as a kind of police force and military, and that they protect the rules that the rulers know the citizens should obey. They protect them by enforcing them, right? They make citizens obey these laws, these rules, and they prevent people from coming in. This is the more military function. They prevent people from coming into the city and changing the way the city operates. So you have the guardians, and that you have the auxiliaries, and then you're going to have also a class of people who make the things that we need to have in order to live good lives, the food, right, the houses, etc. And these are going to be the workers in Socrates' city. And so we have an education process that will produce these three parts in the city. And now, once we get those laid out, which takes Socrates' considerable amount of words to accomplish, right? We're now going to be in book 4. He'll tell us finally in book 4 what justice is in a city. Justice in the city is the three groups of people: the workers, the auxiliaries, and the rulers, each doing its own job. That's what justice is in the city, Socrates thinks. Right? If you have a city in which the people who know what's good aren't ruling, and then, right, you're not going to get a city in which the citizens live good lives. You need the people who know what's good and bad. You need people that know what's good and bad, and you need them to be the rulers. That's the general idea here about what justice is in a city. Okay. Now, once Socrates gets this result, he turns his attention to justice in an individual. And here we can be a little bit briefer because he appeals to the tripartite theory that we've already seen. Remember that in the tripartite theory, there's two parts of the soul, three parts of the soul rather. There's reason, there's spirit, and then there's appetite. And these three parts roughly correspond to the three groups of people that Socrates uncovers here in his description of a rightly founded city, right? So in an individual, reason is the aspect of ourselves that can know what's good and bad. And spirit is the part of us that acts as an ally to reason, right? When reason thinks something is good, spirit can take the side of reason, and together they can hold appetite in check. And when we do that, reason rules, just like the guardians rule in a just city. So Socrates is going to say um, that justice, see if I can find it here, justice is going to be when each of the parts of the soul, justice in an individual human being is going to be when each of the parts of the soul does is organized. Each of the parts of the soul does uh, what it's supposed to do, right? So the reasoning part should rule. This is the fitting organization of the parts of the soul. And remember that what's fitting with respect to human being is going to be justice in a human being, and that the spirited part acts as its ally, and together they hold appetite in check. And so now at the end of book 4, we get an answer to 2 of the 3 questions that we have in the Republic: what justice is in a city and what justice is in an individual. We have that. And now we turn to the last question, right? Remember that Glaucon and Admetus, they challenge Socrates to show that just life is better. And Socrates thinks in order to do that, we need to know what justice is, right? And once we've gotten that in book 4, we're ready to take up the third issue. Now, in these lecture notes, right, we saw that the first set on the theory of justice is the initial conversation in book 1. And then what we have in the next lectures was where Socrates is answering the questions what justice is in a city and in a human being. He's doing that, excuse me, he's doing that as an effort to meet the challenge that Glaucon and Admetus pose for him. And then in the third of the lectures, we give his view, Socrates' argument that he meets the challenge. He thinks he can meet the challenge, namely to show that just life is better. And so that's what we're talking about here. Now, there's a lot, the Republic's long, and so it's hard to keep the argument focused. And there's certain confusing parts about it. But I think the answers to the first 2 questions, what justice is in the city and what justice is in an individual, Socrates gives those answers in books 2 through 4. I think we can see those pretty clearly. But the argument that the just life is better is a little bit more confusing to see, in my view. It occurs in the remaining books, right? The books after book 4, 5 through 10. And initially in book 4, Glaucon's, he's already convinced, right? So Glaucon thinks once he understands what justice is in an individual, he thinks it's pointless to move the inquiry forward, right? From this point, our inquiry becomes absurd, he says, right? So he thinks it's obvious at this point that if justice is the virtue of the soul, that it's going to be true that being just is always better than not being just. Now, Socrates, he is, you might think he'd take the win, but that's not what he does. He agrees that, with Glaucon, that maybe, right, it could seem like we don't need to inquire further, but we really should, he thinks. We need to make our inquiry and our conclusion that the just life is better than the unjust life. We need to make it as clear as we possibly can. And so Socrates undertakes to do that in these books. And the discussion is long and confusing, but eventually, once we get to book 9, Socrates asks Glaucon whether he, Socrates, should proclaim that the best man and the most just to be the happiest, and that he is the most kingly, the one who most rules like a king over himself, and that the worst, the most unjust, is the most unhappy. He's the most tyrannical, the one who is most a tyrant over himself. And Glaucon, so roughly what's being said here as far as the argument goes, right? Socrates says, okay, Glaucon, what do you think now that we've completed our inquiry in detail? Is the happiest the most just or not? And Glaucon says, yes, he's been convinced since book 4. So it's not too surprising that he's still convinced. And so he accepts the conclusion as he had earlier. He accepts it now in book 9 without hesitation. And then Socrates says something that's a little puzzling. He says that, okay, this then would be one of our proofs. And when he says that, we would like to know what the argument is supposed to be for the conclusion, right? The conclusion is that the just life is better. Glaucon agrees that it is, but we want to see the argument. And he says this would be one of our proofs. And the question is, what proof, right? And we haven't really gotten an argument yet. And so it seems that what he means here is that the fact that Glaucon finds it plausible, that's going to be a proof. Now, that's not a very convincing proof, right? But it's going to be a proof. And for the rest of us who haven't been convinced since book 4, like Glaucon has, Socrates says to Glaucon, let's examine this second proof and see if there's anything to it. That's really, as far as I can tell, the real proof is coming, right? So we haven't gotten a proof yet, unless you want to count the fact that Glaucon accepts the conclusion as proof. That's a little bit of a proof. It's just a kind of weak one. And that what we really want to see is the argument for those of us who are already convinced. And we get that where Socrates is talking about the pleasure that accompanies each part of the soul. And he says that in what he describes as the greatest and most decisive overthrow for the just man against the unjust man, that the just get the just, and by the just we mean here the people whose souls are just. And by that we mean that reason knows and rules, spirit is reason's ally, and that appetite is in check, that they arrange things in their lives so that they get what Socrates describes as the truest possible pleasures. And so he thinks it's going to follow that their lives are going to always be more pleasurable than someone's life whose soul is not just. And that's, it seems, is what he means when he finally draws the conclusion in book 10 that we've discovered that justice is best for the soul. Okay. Now, we, of course, may not be convinced, right? And we might think that it's not true, or at least we might not see why it's supposed to be true, that the just have more pleasurable lives than the unjust. If you wanted to follow that up, I lay out the argument here in more detail. So if we click on this, we can look at what the argument might look like. right? So we can set it up in premise conclusion form. So here would be our premises, and here would be our conclusion. And this argument would have does have a valid form. And so the question would be whether the premises are true. And I go through some of the considerations we might want to go through to see whether they're true here. And you can take a look at this if you like. So again, right, in the lecture, on the third lecture on the theory of justice, if you click on, excuse me, if you hit this link, you can see that discussion of the argument. Okay, so that for us completes our discussion of Plato and the theories we find in the middle dialogues. And next time, that completes our discussion in this course of Plato. And next time we're going to move on to Aristotle.